In the book Rome and Persia, as it'll be in America, or The Eagle and the Lion that's already been released here in the UK, I tell the story of the contact and conflict between the Roman Republic, the Principate, the Empire, both in its united form and eventually in the eastern half that survives far longer after the West has collapsed, and the great empire to the east, based around modern-day Iran, Iraq, but stretching into Syria, into Turkey, into Afghanistan and beyond. This was first ruled by the Parthian or Sassanid dynasty, and they were supplanted in the 3rd century AD by the Sassanian Persian dynasty. Altogether, this empire exists for well over 800 years, and it's huge. It isn't quite as big as the Roman Empire. It doesn't have as large a population. These things are very hard to judge in the ancient world, but looking at the settlement patterns and essentially the climate, the topography, what is possible? How many people can this area support? How much food can be generated there, and therefore what sort of population is likely? The Roman Empire had a sea at its heart, the Mediterranean Sea, and it builds around from that. The Parthian and Persian empires is land-based. It edges and ends up bordering on the seas in various directions, like the Arabian Gulf or the Caspian Sea to the north. It's huge, even if it's not as big as the Roman Empire. And in the book I tell the story of this rivalry, and I felt it was very important to tell the story as one, not to separate the Parthians and the Sassanian Persians, as the inclination of scholars tends to be. Now, partly this is a reflection of specialization. This is, after all, an immense swathe of history, and there are people who tend to be specialists in periods rather than covering such a wide area, or if they look at a region in all periods, they look at just that region and not at such a vast imperial possession. But I think it's probably worth saying a few words as to why I feel it's justified to treat the Parthians and the Sassanian Persians as essentially one empire and one entity, as the Persians as a continuation of what the Parthians had been doing before them. Now, to the Roman point of view, this was certainly the case. You'll find historians like Ammianus Marcellinus writing in the 4th century AD, someone who came from the eastern part of the Roman Empire, who served in campaigns against the Sassanian Persians, so has direct experience and talks about this, and yet he will still often refer to them as Parthians. As far as he's concerned, everyone will know what he means. And he talks about traditions. He claims that it's still the same Parthian or Sassanid royal family that is in fact ruling the empire and provides all the kings of kings. Now, most scholars have dismissed this, and obviously we have to be very aware that the Romans saw outsiders through all sorts of lenses of prejudice and ignorance, just like any other people. They didn't know as much about people outside the empire as they knew about people within, logically enough. Exactly the same was true of the Parthians and then the Persians looking at the Roman Empire. They saw it as outsiders, and they will make mistakes. They will misunderstand, they will simplify, they will exaggerate. So, for instance, when you have Shapur I writing these great triumphal inscriptions in the 3rd century AD, talking about his successes over the Romans, yes, he lists all sorts of different peoples from within and outside the Roman Empire who'd come against him and claims these vast numbers for the enemy armies that he'd defeated when he defeated a succession of Roman emperors. Bear in mind, this is a publicity announcement meant to enhance his reputation with the home audience, just as the Res Gestae of the Divine Augustus, set up outside his mausoleum in Rome and copied elsewhere in the empire, was meant for an imperial audience of Romans. It's a leader telling his people what he'd like them to think and how he'd like them to consider him and his reputation and his achievements. So we shouldn't single out, just because it's rarer to have a Parthian or a Persian perspective on events, we shouldn't single those out and say, well, these are inherently more reliable than a Greco-Roman tradition, but we should treat them with exactly the same level of mixed faith and skepticism. We have to be careful. We have to realize that everyone has an angle. Everyone is producing this for a reason. They aren't simply out there to give us 100% accurate historical account explained in every detail of what happened and why and how. But there is a great tendency for Romanists in particular to see the Sassanian Persians as really distinct and quite different, and their empire as a very different beast to the Arsacid Parthian Empire that had preceded it. So it helps to explain some of the great changes within the Roman system. So the 3rd century AD, sometimes part of it is referred to as the 3rd century crisis. It traditionally was seen as a time when the Roman Empire was tearing itself apart in civil war after civil war, where institutions were becoming less efficient, the Senate was marginalized from politics, the army excluded senators from high command, and then started to bring in more and more foreigners. Apparently it was less reliable, less sophisticated. Now, in recent decades, plenty of scholars who focused on late antiquity have taken a cold, hard look at many of these traditional ideas and pointed out many of the flaws. However, they have had a tendency to go too far the other way. The doctrine has tended to become that the Roman Empire changed profoundly in the 3rd century AD because it had to, because suddenly the empire faced a combination of external threats far more serious than anything that had happened before. So in the West, this is seen as the move towards confederation of previously separate Germanic and other tribes beyond the empire, that instead of different individual groups, you have the Franks, the Goths, the Alemanni, all men as it means, confederations that come together under charismatic leaders that muster larger, more efficient, more dangerous armies than any of the individual tribes had been able to do before. While in the east, Ardashir I will overthrow the last Parthian king, and he and his son Shapur I will inflict a series of defeats on large Roman armies led by emperors in person, because the Sassanians are fundamentally better at fighting. They have a better army, a better military system. They are suddenly, apparently miraculously, able to conduct sieges and take fortified places in a way that the Parthians had not been able to do. And therefore, in reaction to this, senators had to be excluded from military command, because in such desperate circumstances you couldn't afford putting amateurs in charge. You needed hardened professionals, men who knew what they were doing, who'd learned through experience, who would do the right thing. And this then combined with the political change, you marginalized the Senate, because again, this was leading to civil war. The problem with this theory is that it builds towards the sense that Diocletian needed to create the tetrarchy. You needed 4 emperors because an emperor simply couldn't be in more than one place at a time, so he needed associates who could go and deal with these bigger problems that were occurring. It doesn't all add up, and I can talk about that on another occasion, and I've done so in more detail in the book How Rome Fell, or The Fall of the West, that's called here in the UK. And I talk about it to some extent in The Eagle and the Lion and Rome and Persia. But let's point out a few basic truths. In the first place, geographically, the Sassanian Persian Empire is pretty much exactly the same as the Arsacid Parthian Empire. There are times when the individual king of kings is stronger or weaker, where territories and provinces on the fringes become less under central control, or they are lost to invasion. One of the constants within this is the periodic appearance of nomadic peoples from the northeast of the empire who sweep in just as the Parthians or their ancestors had themselves centuries before and overrun that territory, who are militarily extremely strong, extremely dangerous, hard to deal with, just as the Romans found it hard to deal with the Huns. And some of these groups that appear are considered to be Hunnic, at least by some of our sources. So there are times when kings of kings are strong, there are times when kings of kings are weak. But essentially they control the same empire. Within that empire, you see a tradition of local and regional kingship. Now, there are some kings of quite large areas, and there appear to be a sort of secondary level of lesser petty kings that rule just districts. And this continues throughout the 8 and more centuries of Parthian and Sassanian Persian rule. This is always the case. There are also large clans or aristocratic families that control, to a fair degree, lots of dependents in areas, particularly in the east and the southeast of the empire. And these are groups like the Suren, the Karen, the Miran, that appear generation after generation. And in the main, as far as we can see, these are Parthian speakers with a Parthian religious and cultural tradition who stay that way right the way through. So that when the Sassanian Persians take over, they might perhaps change the individuals who are in charge, but this whole rebellion is based around gaining majority support of the big noble families that have always been there. And these continue to be powerful families. They continue to supply a very high proportion of the senior commanders, the senior ministers who will serve the Sassanian kings just as they have served the Parthian kings before them. The tradition remains that Ctesiphon, a city founded by the Parthians, is the place where every king of kings is crowned. So many traditions remain, and these aristocratic families keep their language, their religious practices. It's simply integrated into a slightly different administration that is using the Persian language more than the Parthian language. And we can see this from preserved seals and that were on official documents, that these people are still there, and in many cases they will survive the Arab conquest and they'll still be around for generations afterwards. So what you have is a takeover, and once you look more closely at the rise of the Sassanian dynasty in the 3rd century, it all makes far more sense. Because you have to remember that the Ardashir, the founder of the dynasty, is a local ruler. His family background is a little bit difficult to pick out, a little bit obscure. We don't quite know where the name Sasan for the Sassanian family comes from, and whether this is some ancient semi-religious thing, whether it's a specific ancestor or a mix of all. But nevertheless, these come from Persis, from Fars province in modern Iran. And they win local dominance before they move more widely than that. So they take over and defeat other petty kings, then move to be the regional king. There is then the civil war, which is what it is, or an internal rebellion against the current king of kings, the last true ruler of the Arsacid dynasty, who is defeated by Ardashir, aided by one of his sons Shapur, who will become Shapur I. And this triumph is depicted in monuments, it's celebrated in their propaganda, their pronouncements. But they're backed in this war by men from many of the big Parthian clans. And it stands to reason this is not the takeover of a small minority of one ethnic group that has links to an older Achaemenid Persia and even beyond that, and that after centuries of oppression by the Parthians decides as a nationalist movement to throw off the foreigners and supplant them. This is very much a dynastic takeover. They take over with the support of a large part of the significant noble families that are militarily and politically powerful and influential, with backing of the priestly groups. Enough of them back this new leader to allow him to become King of Kings. Now that's a huge break, because it is not 100% clear, but certainly Ardashir I does not boast of Arsacid Parthian descent. That doesn't mean that people like Ammianus were necessarily wrong, but it does look as if at the very least he doesn't come from the main branches of the Arsacid family. There is at least a possibility that there is a connection there somewhere, enough to satisfy sufficient supporters. But it's one of the reasons why there is so much emphasis on the legitimacy and the right to success, the right to rule of Ardashir I and then Shapur. Why they have these monuments where Ahura Mazda, the greatest of the Zoroastrian deities, is shown appointing Ardashir to rule as his heavenly counterpart, in a sense, to the King of Kings on earth. A sense of restoring things. So to make a successful rebellion, you need to claim that the current incumbent is not a legitimate, not a successful, not a proper ruler. And recent defeats against the Romans have probably helped with that. But you present yourself as a better candidate, but within fairly traditional language, fairly traditional mechanisms. So what you have is a new dynasty, and a new dynasty that has fought its way to power. So rather than this sudden dramatic change that Romanists in particular tend to like, that along comes Ardashir I, Shapur I, and they're just better warriors at the head of a better army than the Parthians have ever mustered, and the Romans simply can't deal with this. The threat is too great. But think of it another way. Ardashir I has fought his way to power by suggesting the current King of Kings is not fit to rule. doesn't have the backing of heaven, doesn't have divine backing, whereas he does. He's won because the gods are on his side. Right is on his side. He needs to prove himself to be a legitimate ruler by success, by glory, by setting things right. And some of that's how he deals with the nobles internally. But also, if you want to unite an empire that you've just seized by force, the obvious thing to do is to find a common enemy. Find someone to fight. Find someone for everyone to hate. And the Romans are perfect candidates because of the long history of rivalry and conflict and the recent Roman successes that have been humiliations for the Parthians. So Ardashir I and after him Shapur I, who wasn't necessarily the son destined to succeed and has potential rivals, need to prove themselves as great war leaders. And it happens that at this time the Roman Empire is also considerably more vulnerable than it has been for a long time because it is fighting civil war after civil war. The army is turning against itself, it's not always stationed where it should be, and levels of discipline are not always that great. So the Romans are weaker than usual. You have a new dynasty that needs to assert itself militarily. Though it is interesting to see these wars are quite controlled, and for all the grand successes of Shapur, for all his deep expeditions well into the Roman provinces where he'll reach the Mediterranean Sea, he'll sack Antioch, he is quite restrained in his objectives. He isn't trying to conquer any territory. It's simply an assertion of power, of glory, bringing back plunder, bringing back captives to help reward followers and build up his own power. So the context of these wars is less a sudden switch between inefficient Arsacid Parthians and suddenly militant and capable Sassanian Persians, but far more nuanced. This is an individual situation where you have one dynasty needing to prove itself and firmly establish itself as the new rulers. And while we know that the Sassanian Persians are going to be around for 400 years, people at the time did not know that. Hindsight is always the enemy of understanding the past properly. So this is a dynasty that needs to assert itself. We have a big problem when we come to the military aspect of this and trying to see whether suddenly Ardashir and Shapur I are doing things differently. They have a different sort of army, fundamentally different to its Parthian predecessors. And the biggest problem we have in understanding this is that we know so little about what Parthian armies were like in the 2nd century, even to a great extent the 1st century AD. After the descriptions of Karhai and those early conflicts, there's very little to tell us about balance between cataphracts and horse archers, about the role of infantry, and about the Parthians' capacity for siegecraft. There's a few throwaway lines in Dio, for instance, where he says they're not very good at this because they can't stay in one place for too long because they've got to feed all these horses and they don't organise their logistics properly. On the other hand, throughout Parthian history, they have taken cities, well-fortified ones. Sometimes by storm, sometimes presumably by blockade. So it might not be as simple as that. And we might be looking at a much slower evolution of military capacity in terms of siegecraft and the like under the Parthians that's continued by the Sassanian Persians, rather than Ardashir or Shapur either having great ideas themselves or finding other people who did. It's very hard to know with any of these military changes. We don't really have enough good evidence to know what the Parthians were like and what they were doing. What we can definitely say is that Ardashir I fights his way to power, which means that he's got an army that's used to winning, that is a well-practiced, efficient and confident team around which he can base an even wider army once he is King of Kings to take on the Romans. And the same is true of Shapur I. These are both men who've spent a lot of their time fighting. Compared to other kings of kings, these are experienced and successful and, one assumes, very capable military men, as well as very capable statesmen. It's no mean feat to overthrow a dynasty that's been around for 4.5 centuries and put yourself in its place and make everyone accept you to a degree that it's 400 years before anybody from outside your family can even be considered a king of kings. So these are people like Augustus, whom we know more about, who will profoundly change a political system. And some of that is down to luck, some of it is down to wider trends within society, some of it is always down to the sheer ability of the men involved. And we should never forget that. But what it comes back to is to say this: if you look in a broader way, if you remove the need to explain Rome's changes in the 3rd century by external factors, then suddenly it becomes very obvious that this is essentially the same empire, and that the military competition that goes on between the Romans and between the Parthians and the Sassanian Persians is a long, ongoing struggle. And neither side is perfect. Each side makes mistakes, but they also learn. Each side is able to develop new ideas, new concepts. The military systems of both empires change during this period, and they adapt to each other. It's almost a sort of cat and mouse game where one side gets an advantage, and then after a while, or perhaps quickly, the other side works out how to counter that, they gain an advantage, and it sways back and forth. That's the story. That's one of the underlying themes through the book The Eagle and the Lion and Roman Persia.